Part 19. Bree Canyon Road, 3:31 a.m. Sarah was watching Reese closely, the way he hunkered down ahead of her, a ragged, hyper-combat dancer, balancing his body as he weaved through the brush. His eyes scanned almost like a security camera, unblinking, darting in quick jerks, looking at the edges of objects rather than right at them, drinking in the chaotic terrain. He was a cat on the prowl, Grace in action, his battered body hard and yet flexible, the bruised muscles gliding under the skin. He was a soldier. She could see that now. He had done this kind of thing so often that it was second nature. It was an anticlimactic revelation, but now she fully believed his story. Everything that had happened up to now, the slaughter at the police station, the maniacal maelstrom of the streets, the utterly incomprehensible explosion of reality at Tech Noir, were super real. Somehow, in the police station, her mind had disconnected from her body, and now it was a calm, simple observation of Reese's professionalism in the field that caused her to reconnect and accept the truth. A robot from the future was trying to kill her. Sorry, cyborg, Sarah corrected mentally, as if it mattered. A killing machine in the shape of a man had cut through 30 armed policemen like one of the harvesting combines that thrashed through the fields of wheat. It had been hit by numerous bullets and kept on coming. And all that seemed to stand between her and the monstrosity was this soldier, who looked very young, and even though he moved with practiced precision, seemed as afraid as she felt. They came to a concrete drainage culvert under the 57 freeway, forming a dark, smooth-surfaced cave for them to huddle in. Reese aimed the flashlight he had taken from the car into the interior. The floor was wet with brackish, green-skinned water. Sarah wrinkled her nose at the dank smell, but slid down the wall opposite Reese anyway. Exhausted, Reese squatted on his haunches, following the beam of the flashlight, still examining their impromptu haven, slowly winding down from the night's frenzy. He looked at her finally, his eyes now surprisingly soft. His voice was a raspy whisper that cut through the thick silence with a militaristic efficiency, but there seemed to be real concern there as well. "You damaged?" Sarah laughed abruptly, and then sobered as she realized she could have easily been shot. She looked down. No blood, no pain in any particular spot. "I'm okay," she replied, and then felt compelled to add, "Reese, it's real. I mean the war, everything you said." It was an acceptance, not a question, so Reese did not answer. He was looking at her with the same intensity he had previously devoted to the landscape. Is he watching for me to crack? Sarah wondered. Break down into hysterics. She wasn't going to do that. She was amazed she wasn't, but no, she wouldn't, though the hysteria still hovered in the wings, not far away. There was only one problem facing her, and it was a real puzzler. She couldn't cry now. It seemed to Sarah that she should, considering that, in the near future, the world would go so insane, that millions would die in agony under the grinding heel of some hideous descendant of an Apple computer, like Chuck's little organizer. But she couldn't cry, because none of it had happened yet. But then, where did this man opposite her come from? And that thing, so intent on destroying her. It had killed dozens of innocents. As the chill of the cold cement seeped into her back, a deeper chill flowed from within to meet it. If Reese hadn't made it through time displacement to protect her, she'd be dead. And no one would have known why. She was alone in this thing, without even the luxury of feeling secure about police protection. Alone and shivering in a damp hole in the middle of the night, with a stranger, an insane-looking street tough in torn rags, a scarred teenager wise beyond his years in dealing death. He had saved her. Sarah caught his eye and tried a trembling smile. "Reese, what's your first name?" "Kyle." Kyle, she went on, her voice wavering. I wouldn't be alive now unless you came along. I want to thank you. Rhys allowed himself to look into her eyes. Just a girl, he kept mentally repeating to himself. A target that needs cover, he added. And then, to help him maintain, he said aloud, just doing my job. Sarah nodded, satisfied with that for the time being. Rhys went back to listening. A car was coming. Maybe 1,000 meters out. Hostile? Unlikely. He waited, poised between tense and relaxed, and let another sound in. The wind blew so soft and huge out here that it seemed to him as if he could hear the whole world breathing. It humbled him. He could sense the smell of animals on the wind, maybe dogs, he wasn't sure. The car rushed by overhead in a rumbling whoosh. Rhys's hand had tensed on the police service revolver at his waist, then relaxed as the car sped on without hesitation. Sarah was holding herself and shivering uncontrollably now, a combination of aftershock and keen air. He came across the tunnel in an efficient, fluid movement and slipped his arm around her shoulder. At first, Sarah recoiled. His clothes were rank with ancient sweat, but his body was blazing with heat. Even through the raincoat, she could feel it and was instantly warmer. She looked up, gratefully, but now he was staring out at the night, his expression gone intense and focused, yet somehow far away. There was no emotion in his action, except duty. Despite that and the rank odour, she slid her arms around his torso and clung to him. She felt his body contracting with measured breaths. His muscles felt like heated metal bands beneath his skin. Maybe he was a cyborg too. A cyborg from an unimaginable future of pain and horror. Kyle, what's it like going through time? For a moment, he stopped breathing, thinking about it as if for the first time. White light, pain, a kind of pushing through something. I don't know, like being born maybe. Then she felt something like thick, hot coffee trickling down her arm and pulled back. She grabbed the flashlight from him and aimed it at her hand. Blood. Oh my God! Rhys looked down at the blood oozing from his arm, as if he were remembering an unpleasant dream. Yeah, I caught one back there. Sarah didn't get it for a second. Caught one? You mean you got shot? He nodded. It's not bad. Don't worry. She put the beam on his arm. There was a tiny hole in the raincoat, like a cigarette burn, but the whole upper arm was slick with blood. Are you crazy? We got to get you to a doctor. Forget it. Sarah gingerly opened his raincoat and pulled it off his shoulders. Here, take this off. Rhys carefully removed the coat and looked at the wound with suppressed relief. He had thought it was bad, really, and just didn't want to look. See, he said. Passed right through the meat. Sarah stared at the tiny hole neatly punched into his tricep, still oozing blood around a clump of navy blue fabric that had been driven into the wound from the raincoat. Rhys gently turned the muscle in the wavering flashlight, and Sarah saw the larger and more ragged exit hole. Despite all the violence of the past few hours, this was her first real look at what a bullet did to human flesh. It was both appalling and fascinating. Mostly appalling. The wound needed dressing, and she was elected. That was why Rhys had handed her the first aid kit. Get to work, she thought. Try not to think about it. She would have to clean it first. That would mean touching it. Jesus, this was getting too real. Sarah opened the first aid kit. Bandages, ointment, pills, gauze, peroxide, swabs. This stuff was for scraped knees, not bullet holes. She grabbed the cotton swab and edged closer to him. He watched her, fascinated and amused. Jesus, this is going to make me puke. Talk about something, would you? Anything, I don't care. What? Sarah almost laughed. She had a billion questions she wanted answers to, like her son. She had a child, he had said. Or would have, will have had. They didn't make tenses for this situation. Tell me about my son. Is he tall? About my height. He has your eyes. She started soaking the blood out of the wound, and he winced, then motioned for her to continue. As gently as she could, Sarah went back to work, biting her lip and concentrating on his words so she wouldn't upchuck all over his arm. It's hard to explain. You trust him. He's got that strength of will. You know he could do anything once he's decided that was what had to be done. My father, I don't remember him. I always picture him like John. He knows how to lead men. They'll follow him anywhere. I'd die for John Connor. He spoke the last in a low, passionate voice, and she believed he meant it, and Sarah now knew that he was capable of emotion, the pure, hard, undistilled fanaticism of the young, a passion she had never been able to feel for anything or anyone. At least now I know what to name him. She chuckled. It was a joke, right? Reese didn't smile, and she realized it really wasn't. There was too much pain behind his eyes. She tried again. Do you know who the father is, so I won't tell him to get lost when I meet him? Reese shrugged. No, John never said much about him. I know he died before the war and... Wait, Sarah interrupted. I don't want to know. She went back to the impromptu bandage. He was quiet, watching her fingers becoming more sure as she worked. Then Sarah said, Did John send you? Reese turned away, going grim and tight again. I volunteered. Volunteered? He faced her again. Of course. A chance to meet John Connor's mother? You're a legend. The hero behind the hero. He winced as she tied off the gauze. Go on, make it tight, he said, then continued. You taught him how to fight, to hide, organize. From when he was a kid, from when you were in hiding, before the war. Sarah held up her hand, a confused look coming into her eyes. You're talking about things I haven't done yet, in the past tense. It's driving me crazy. She yanked the gauze ends into a knot, forgetting herself for a moment, and Reese muffled a groan. More gently, she finished tying off the bandage. I'm sorry, but are you sure you have the right person? He locked eyes with her. Sarah saw that look again, and it had nothing to do with his duty. It was he looking directly into her, the Sarah inside the body. The little Sarahs cringed back under his naked stare. I'm sure, he said, and he was, physically certain at least. His doubts were in other areas. Sarah got to her feet, exasperated. Come on, do I look like the mother of the future? Am I tough, organized? I can't even balance my checkbook. Reese heard the tone of her voice more than the words. It was the same whining, defeated tone that many of the scabs had voiced when John had asked them to risk danger for the cause. It was a tone of voice he despised, because it was the same attitude that had prevented men from defeating the machines years earlier. The blind, bleating acceptance of whatever the fates had in store for them. Whole religions and elaborate philosophies had been developed to give weight to this sickeningly weak tone of voice, until John had stepped out of the ashes with a pincer grenade and blown the tracks off an HK, until John risked death, standing in the flaming wreckage, siphoning off the unburned fuel to power his armoured car. Because of his example, John's call was answered. Men rallied to him, and kept rallying, and when Reese was old enough, he cut himself loose from the street pack and joined as well, glad to be away from that pathetic, why me, bleating that he despised so much. Reese had been reeling back and forth from awe to disgust ever since he had first seen Sarah earlier that day. He remembered his briefing. Sarah Connor was simply a 20-year-old part-time waitress who was still in school and who so far had exhibited no unusual abilities or talents. She was the equivalent of a gangly female scav, rooting around blindly in the rubble, unaware of her own power to resist and change her fate. He had known many scavs like that. And once they had been shown the way, they had become good soldiers. So it might be with Sarah. But he was no recruiter. All he knew was survival. He had volunteered for this mission fully expecting to be passed over in favour of an older, more tempered fighter. When John had personally summoned him, he was flattered by the sudden realisation of the enormous responsibility he was taking on. His performance would profoundly affect all human history. John had told him that. Before volunteering, all Reese had thought about was the chance of carrying out the most important order John had ever issued, and the glorious honour of meeting John's beautiful mother in the flesh. Most of the mission's impact had escaped him. It had all happened so fast. So fast. Once John's forces had captured the time displacement lab, he had been notified of the special mission and immediately put his name into the hat. Minutes later, he had reported to John's command bunker and was rapidly briefed. He recalled now what John had stressed, the awesome importance that he succeed in the mission, and the wondrous certainty that Reese would succeed. That look of confidence, more than the uppers the meds were hypoing into Reese's veins, had jumped him into combat ready. And then, as Reese saluted, John had embraced him. That caught Reese completely by surprise. John Connor was a hard man to get close to. After his mother had died, he became a brooding loner who opened up to no one. He was adored by his followers because he never asked them to do anything he wasn't about to do, and because he knew what to do. He was never really intimate with anyone. But John said that Reese was the pivot of fate, and then threw his arms around him, as if they were old friends. As John turned away to see to other technical matters, there was an expression of deep sadness that Reese knew he was not meant to see. Perhaps John's confidence had been faked to give Reese courage. That other look troubled him. Now as he thought of what he and Sarah would have to do to survive, he remembered both of John's expressions, and how little the briefing had actually told him before they shunted him through that endless instant of time travel. As far as Reese knew, he was the first living man to be temporarily displaced. Skynet had developed the hardware as part of its voracious research and development, a geometrically expanding, computer-generated repertoire of new technologies. The human raiders had seized the place intact, and the techs had scurried to download the system files and analyze them. When they realized what Skynet had done in its coldly rational desperation, John had opted to use its own technology as counterforce. But when Reese had stepped into the biaxial node of the field generator, no one really knew if the time displacement was survivable. He might have arrived in 1984, an already cooling bag of meat, his heart stopped by unfathomable energies. "Look, Reese," Sarah was saying, "I didn't ask for this, and I don't want any part of it." She was going to cry. Her hair was matted with drying sweat. Her clothes were filthy and torn. She wasn't a legend. She was a whining little scav, about to weep uncontrollably at his feet, and now, in addition to keeping her alive, he had to keep her sane and strong. Something he hardly knew how to do for himself. Then he remembered the last thing John told him he must do. He made his voice loud and calm. "Sarah." She stopped pacing like a cornered animal and faced him. "Your son gave me a message to give to you, made me memorize it." She froze in position, blinking, not knowing what to expect. Reese went on, his voice softer. a hint of the original speaker's love behind the rote repetition. I never got a chance to thank you properly for your love and courage through all the dark years. I can't help you with what you must soon face, except to say that the future is not set in stone. I have seen humanity rise up from defeat, and I have been privileged to lead the way. You must preserve our victory. You must be stronger than you imagine you can be. You must survive, or I will never exist. Rhys could see her calming down. The words were washing over her. He hadn't meant to let so much of his own feelings spill through, but it was all right, because she seemed to be responding. Rhys flexed his hand. There wasn't much pain now, nothing he couldn't handle anyway, and his hand still retained over 75% mobility. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance of making it. If they could stay in the clear, leaving no traceable data, they could lie low indefinitely. To encourage her, Rhys said, "Good field dressing." Sarah smiled wearily. "You like it? It's my first." She felt the irony of her words. She still rejected the mantle of responsibility that was thrust on her. At least she did emotionally. But some very logical component deep inside her had accepted that she would one day do these things, just as she now accepted the impending incineration of civilization some years hence, and all the horrors of the world thereafter. There would be many wounds, many bandages, tragedies and losses unimaginable. Sarah shivered as the endless dark landscape seemed to spread out before her. A word came to her. Destiny. It was like being in a play. You could change the performance, but you could not change the ending. She remembered a play she had been in back in junior high. She had liked one of the other characters, but he kept dying in Act 3, night after night, and she remembered how naively bitter she had been. Just once, she wanted the character's illness not to have been fatal. She didn't like acting that much after that, and she didn't like destiny as a concept much either. Another vehicle rumbled past overhead, a long-bed truck, diesel engine hammering out a thunderous rhythm. Rhys could see she was dead on her feet. "Get some sleep. It'll be light soon." She sat next to him, back against the cold concrete. The tension between them still hung in the air, and he put his arm around her. For a moment he thought he might be suffering from time displacement aftershock, for it seemed as if huddling there had always been his life, and she had always been with him. Sarah was exhausted. She had to sleep, and was halfway there when Rhys stiffened as the sound of the crickets began. It made her feel more secure. She realized that even though Kyle must be bone-tired, he would come awake should anyone, or anything, approach. He was a strange, haunted boy. She realized that Rhys might never have heard a cricket before. Being next to him, in this necessary intimacy, made her feel serene, despite the psychotic nightmare she had just come through. When he made his voice soft, she felt soothed and protected. She wanted to hear more. "Tell me about where you're from. Just anything you want. It'll help me sleep." "All right," he said. "You stay down by day, but at night you can move around. The HKs use infrared, so you still have to watch out, especially for the aerials. But they're not too bright. John taught us ways to dust them." It got tough when the infiltrators began to appear. The Terminators were the newest, the worst. She felt herself drifting, melting into him, as he talked about a place of noise and flame, of white ash and fire-gutted ruins, moonlit patrol craft sending harsh beams and plasma bursts into the rag-wrapped scavengers, rooting through the collapsed cities for unburned cans of food, blackened bones, and gleaming human hunting machines grinding their blood-streaked chrome bodies through a pack of scavs, like sharks in a feeding frenzy. Rhys was still talking when Sarah's eyelids fluttered closed. Her head sagged against his shoulder. He could see only the top of it and could not tell if she was asleep. He went on with his account, which had no narrative structure whatsoever and consisted of stark images, unplaced in his personal chronology. Bits of combat lore and survival tips, anecdotes, and slices of life in the 21st century. Sarah's last conscious thought was a curious one, and she would only recall it later. She thought he sounded poetic, like a street poet who can convey images clearly with coarse and unstructured juxtapositions of words. Born into another life and time, he might have been an artist or a songwriter, but those counter-survival impulses were virtually eradicated, and their faint vestiges manifested themselves now only in the vivid starkness of his description. Her thought that Reese was a soldier with the heart of a poet would resurface later, only then to be tinged with desperate sadness. Reese's words still reached her as she slipped into REM sleep, and they triggered images, both stunning and surreal, in the dark catacomb of her dreams.